Welcome to another upload in the series called So and So New. This one's called Francis Mears New, and those who have been following these uploads will know exactly what they're about. There's one called Henry Peacham New, John Warren New, William Covell New, Ben Jonson New, etc. And the idea behind them is to show how contemporaries of William Shakespeare knew perfectly well that Shakespeare was a pseudonym used by the Earl of Oxford. So this is one in those series, and what we're going to look at now is how Francis Mears knew and how he ciphered that fact into one of his books, in this case called Paladis Tamia, which is the treasury of Pallas, or Wit's Treasury as it's called. So that's what we're going to look at today, and we're going to concentrate specifically on this paragraph within the book in which he talks about the best poets for comedy, and he lists a lot of Greek and Roman ones, and he lists a lot of English ones to show that the Greek and Romans are of the same level, or more specifically that the English ones are just as good as the Greek and Roman ones. This paragraph has given a little bit of relief, a vague sigh of relief to Stratfordians who are very against the idea that the Earl of Oxford is Shakespeare, because they bring it forward to say, look here, you have Edward, Earl of Oxford, listed as the best for comedy there, and among the English names is also Shakespeare. So therefore, ha ha ha, Shakespeare can't be a pseudonym for the Earl of Oxford, or at least Francis Mears must have thought they were two different people. Here you see this plaintive, anxious-looking man. His name is James Shapiro, and he's quite a distinguished professor of Shakespeare, Stratfordian, of course, from a university in America, and he writes crushingly for those who want to believe that the Earl of Oxford and Shakespeare were one and the same writer. Mears names both and distinguishes between them, including both Edward, Earl of Oxford, and Shakespeare in his list of the best writers for comedy. So he is so confident of this, Professor Shapiro, that he thinks it's actually crushing for Oxfordians. Well, what I'm going to show you is the opposite is the case, and Francis Mears knew perfectly well that Earl of Oxford was using the pseudonym Shakespeare, and he enciphers that fact into this exact paragraph that James Shapiro is talking about. Of course, you need to understand all these references to Shakespeare. You have to read deeply. You can't just do shallow reading, and it's a sad indictment, really, of a lot of Stratfordian scholars. They all admit that there's something cryptic about the references to Shakespeare, but they're not prepared to dig and do a deep reading and find out what it is. I think for the obvious fear that they know that everybody's basically telling us that it's a pseudonym for the Earl of Oxford. Okay, a little bit of background. Here's another book by Francis Mears, actually published in the previous year, and you can see it's called God's Arithmetic. What does that tell us? Well, it tells us that Francis Mears is a numerologist. You see just underneath his name, it says he's a Master of Art at both universities. That's Oxford and Cambridge, an MA from Oxford and Cambridge, and student of divinity. So he's a religious man, and he's a numerologist. What is a numerologist? Well, it's someone who believes that God created the universe using numbers and letters, and to reach the eternal life, to get close to God, you need to study the world and its relation to numbers and letters, and by doing that you get closer to God. So that's what Francis Mears is about. So let's now look at this Wit's Treasury, the book that came out the following year, and just have a look at some funny things about it. I turn on to a random page here, and one of the first things you'll notice is all the paragraphs begin with the word as. Actually, this book, which is quite thick, contains about 2,500 paragraphs that all begin with the word as. And if you look in the middle of the paragraph, you see the word so is repeated. So we have as such and such is the case, so such and such is the case. In other words, a sort of equal sign. He's comparing the top half of his paragraph to the second half of his paragraph in every single one. Now we're going to look at the specific paragraph which has Oxford and Shakespeare in it. It comes within this chapter, which is called A Comparative Discourse of Our English Poets with the Greek, Latin and Italian Poets. So he's quite obvious what that means. To compare is to bring together, to draw a comparison, English poets with Greek, Latin, and Italian poets. Let's see how he begins it then. As Greece had three poets of great antiquity, Orpheus, Linus, and Musaeus, and Italy, other three ancient poets, Livius Andronicus, Ennius, and Plautus, so hath England three ancient poets, Chaucer, Gower, and Lydgate. So you see what he's done. He's done three for the ancients, three for the Latins, sorry, three for the Greeks, three for the Latins, and three for the English. So it's all nicely balanced in a little triad. If we carry on, as Homer is reputed the prince of Greek poets and Petrarch of Italian poets, so Chaucer is accounted the god of English poets. So again, we have one from Greece, one from Italy, and one from England. Nice, neat little triad. Now, what's he doing here? What's the point of all this? Well, the point is very simple. In Mears's mind, anything that is random or unaccountable in terms of numbers, or disordered, let's say, is the devil's work. And anything that shows numerical order shows the will and purpose of God, the divine will. So what he's doing here in an age when a lot of Puritans were really getting uppity and saying poetry is ghastly and poetry is the devil's work, he's putting poets into numerical groups. And so then he can say, look, you see, the poets are God's will, poets are good things, and we shouldn't follow the Puritans in wanting to get rid of them. So take another random one, as the Latins have these emblematis, Andreas Alciatus, Rufnerius, Sambuscus. So we have Geoffrey Whitney, Andrew Willett, and Thomas Combe. Again, he's just put two groups, one of three and another group of three, to perfect symmetrical balance. Okay, let's now turn to this paragraph. Paragraph 34, and I have to say that the work that Oxfordians have done on this paragraph is absolutely incredible. The untangling of it, the deciphering of it, which started with the great philologist Enoch Powell, I think back in the 60s or 70s, the late and much lamented Robert de Tobel, a brilliant Oxfordian scholar, contributed something to this, and the presently living and utterly brilliant Professor Roger Strittmatter also made an enormous stride to break the code on it. So a lot of this work isn't mine. I've put some things into it, but it's not really about claiming priority. It's about showing how Mears knew that Oxford was Shakespeare. Now, first thing about this paragraph I'd like to bring up. Let's look where the Edward Earl of Oxford is written. You've got Edward Earl of Oxford followed by Dr. Gager of Oxford. You've got of Oxford, of Oxford. It's like Noah's Ark, 2 by 2. They're actually followed by Master Rowley of Learned Pembroke Hall, who's followed by Master Edwards of Her Majesty's Chapel. Again, a little pairing. If we keep going for a little while, we have Lillian Lodge, and alliterative pairing, 2 L's, followed by Gascoigne and Green, another alliterative pairing. Then Shakespeare, doesn't seem to pair with anyone. Then we have Thomas Nash and Thomas Hayward. We've got 2 Thomases. I'm not sure I can utterly complete this. You can see at the end, Hathaway is paired with Henry Chettle, with those 2 alliterative pairing capital H's. But the point is clearly made that that Mears loves pairing things. I mean, it's pretty obvious that's what he loves doing, but from the as and so, that's exactly what the whole book is about, is making pairs. So with this particular paragraph, I'm going to do the ultimate pairing and draw the paragraph together. You see that it starts at the bottom of the left hand and goes to the top of the right. Let's put the 2 sections together as one paragraph. Now, first thing you'll notice about this is it starts with the word the, and as I've shown you, there are 2,500 paragraphs in this book that begin with the word as such and such, so such and such. We should be making comparisons, and it's rather odd we don't have an as. If we count the Greek and Latin comic playwrights here, there are 16 of them. And then, of course, yes, we do get our so clause, and we count the English, and whoops-a-daisy, we got a problem straight away. We've got 17 English playwrights set against 16 classical playwrights. There should be 16 English playwrights. Only 16. Can't have 17. There's an overspill there. So something odd is going on. The so, I think, tells you that there should be a balance, but we don't have the as. So there's a little clue there that something odd's happening. I've written the number 34 at the top, and the reason for that, although the paragraphs are unnumbered, is that this is actually paragraph 34 if you count them. And I think therein lies a little clue as to how we're going to untangle this, because among the many properties of 34, one of them is it is 17 plus 17, i.e. there are two 17s in 34. Now, as I've just said, we know that we should, according to Mears's normal rules, we should have only 16 English playwrights, but we got 17. So I think the clue that Mears is laying here is to say, find two playwrights on the English side who are numbers 17, and you'll find that actually they're doubling each other. In other words, there are two names on the English side that represent only one person. Well, of course, if you're Oxfordian, you kind of already guessed the answer, because the Earl of Oxford is using the pseudonym Shakespeare. But how are we going to untangle this and show that that is indeed what Mears intends? Okay, well, the first thing, let's try to identify the two playwrights who are number 17. Okay, if we count 16 playwrights down from the top, that's all the Latin ones, then yes, the 17th playwright is Edward, Earl of Oxford. If we were to do exactly the same thing counting from the bottom upwards, Henry Chettle, Hathaway, Wilson, Porter, Chapman, etc., then yes, the 17th playwright from the bottom is again the Earl of Oxford. And let us never forget that the Earl of Oxford is the 17th Earl of Oxford. So 3 times we can identify Edward, Earl of Oxford, as number 17. And this book begins with the words tria sunt omnia, which means threes are all. And if anybody who has been following the decryptions about where Shakespeare's buried, etc., will notice that this idea of triangulation of threes is absolutely key to deciphering a great many encryptions from this period. So the fact that Edward de Vere is not once, twice, but 3 times named as number 17 means that he is unquestionably validated as one of the playwrights who is number 17. Okay, what about the other playwright who's number 17? Let's now count upwards from the bottom, but instead of counting the names, let's count the words. So we have Chettle, Henry, and Hathaway, etc. And yes, the 17th word from the end is Shakespeare. But of course, he is only 17 once, and to validate this, he must be 17 3 times. So we're going to get to that point, but first of all, let's try and work out a bit more about what the Earl of Oxford is doing sitting right there. I should have mentioned this first. I'm sorry, I've been surprised by my own presentation here. Shakespeare sits with 8 English names above his name and 8 English names below. So he is dead center of the English playwrights in exactly the same way as Edward, Earl of Oxford, is dead center of all of the playwrights, i.e. the Roman and the Greek ones and the English ones, of the whole paragraph. In fact, if you look at Edward, Earl of Oxford's position there, you can see how centered he really is. He's centered to the line. There are 9 lines in front of him, so he's on the 10th line counting from the top. And yes, he's on the 10th line counting from the bottom. 10 and 10. I-O, I-O. Most of you will probably recognize that as what's known the Iopian. It's what you say when you greet or when you call Apollo. I-O, I-O. And 10, of course, in Greek is iota. So we've got the double 10, the I-O, I-O. We have Edward, Earl of Oxford, bang in the center. So he is in a position that represents Apollo. Apollo, of course, is in the center of everything. He's Phoebus Apollo, the sun, and he is right in the very center, casting his rays outwards. So Oxford is in a position of Apollo, and Apollo is Io, and he is 0, i.e. nothing, the 0 point, right damn in the center, and he is also number 1. Io, that's what it means. 10 is 1 and 0, and in ancient times 1 and 0 are regarded as the same thing. One among a number is reckoned num, or unus non est numerus, one is no number. I hope you're following this and it's not too complicated, but the point I'm trying to make very simply is that the position that Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford, has on this paragraph, right in the centre of the lines, right in the centre of the names, centred upon the centre line, is representative of his position as Apollo, and Apollo is 1 or 0, and where you see him in the centre of this paragraph here, he is clearly representing 0, the point right at the centre. So what we're now going to do is get him to represent number 1, and this is where the great genius of Roger Strittmatter comes in, the American professor who tried this out first, and he put Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford, as 1, and then he listed all of the Roman and Greek playwrights in exactly the same order that Mears had them in his paragraph below his name, and next to those all the English playwrights, again in exactly the same order as they were in Mears's paragraph, put alongside them. Now, remember what we've seen, that Mears is an obsessive of two things. One is numbers and one is pairings. Well, let us start with the numbers. So Edward de Vere as Apollo is there, number 1, where he was number 0. So let's count the names. Menander, Geiger, Aristo, etc. And we come to number 17 is Shakespeare. Count up from the bottom, Henry Chettle, Romanus, Hathaway. And number 17 is again Shakespeare. And you will remember, of course, that Shakespeare was the 17th word from the end of the paragraph. So now we have Shakespeare 3 times listed as number 17. Tria sunt omnia, 3s are all. We have therefore validated our second playwright who is unquestionably identified by the number 17. It is Edward, Earl of Oxford, and William Shakespeare. Now, that brings us a question. We now know there is only one person representing both of those names, but we still don't know whether Edward, Earl of Oxford, went to Stratford Shakespeare and slipped him some money and said, will you write all the plays that I'll pretend to write? Or if Edward, Earl of Oxford, used the pseudonym William Shakespeare. So we need Mears to tell us which of these two names is not a playwright and which one is the actual playwright. To unravel this, we go to Roger Strittmatter's pairing, and let's have a look how these Greeks and Latins are paired with these English. Start taking a random one here. Alexis Terrius, he wrote a comedy called The Nymphs, and John Lilly, one of his most famous comedies is called Love's Metamorphosis, and it's about 3 nymphs, so we can see why Mears put those two together. Menander and Geiger, well, they're both absolutely obsessed by Euripides, and Menander wrote Methe, a famous play about drunkenness, and Geiger's Rivals, all about drunkenness. Amipsius Athanasis is put together with Atheniensis is put together with Gascoigne. Gascoigne was made very famous in 1573 by a lot of very dirty poems about adultery, and Amipsas's most famous play is called The Adulterers. Terence and Chapman. Terence, of course, was a Latin playwright, and Chapman an English one, but they both absolutely obsessed by Greek sources. Lodge wrote Looking Glass for London. It's all about unscrupulous moneylender. And Nicostratus wrote a play called The Moneylender. You see what's going on here. Anthony Mundy is quite interesting when you remember in the paragraph he's saying our best plotter or the best plotter, and he's next to Plautus, which is quite funny. Plotters. I think there's probably a joke going on there. Also, of course, Anthony Mundy, whether he's good at writing plots for plays, was certainly a plotter in the sense of being a spy. But no, he and Plautus are put together. Both of them wrote each a famous play about a braggart soldier. Plautus, I think, called Miles Gloriosus. Sorry, I might be in danger of getting boring, so I think you're getting the point. Atheniensis wrote The Fishes, Nash wrote Red Herring thing, and Green writing about lust and debauchery, etc. Now, let's move to the point that we've really got to make here. Shakespeare is paired with Aristonymus. Why? What do we know about Aristonymus? Interestingly, we know absolutely nothing about him whatsoever. In fact, we don't even know the title of a single one of his plays, except that he was roughly a contemporary of Aristophanes. So why did Mears, who's so keen on pairing these English to these classical writers, put Shakespeare next to Aristonymus? Well, I think the answer lies, this was Roger Strickmatter who discovered it. The answer lies in the name Aristonymus, which comes from the Greek, Aristonymos, which is Greek for noble or aristocratic name. Well, Shakespeare is not a noble or aristocratic name. There is only one noble or aristocratic name on the whole of that list, and that is Edward, Earl of Oxford. So we know that he is the playwright who's supposed to be there, and Shakespeare, therefore, is the pseudonym that he is using. So that's all pretty simple, one would have thought. Let's go back to this paragraph now, because we've sorted an awful lot out by just taking it to pieces and putting it back like that. So we can now put the Earl of Oxford really where he belongs, on top of Shakespeare, and I'll show you why he belongs there specifically in just a moment. That leaves, of course, a space in the centre, where number 1 on the English side is now naught, nothing. Again, that was the little joke about Apollo, and as Shakespeare says, among a number 1 is reckoned none, then in the number let me pass untold. So there's rather a beautiful little irony in there from Sonnet 136, that we've now got the Earl of Oxford passing untold as number 1 naught, and the Earl of Oxford's now moved down on top of where Shakespeare was. So we now have, I think, restored our balance very nicely. We've got 16 names, as Mears would want, on the classical side, and 16 names now on the English side. So we can put our as where it should be at the top of the paragraph. As the best poets for comedy among the Greeks are these, so the best for comedy amongst us be, starting with Dr. Gager. Now, just look where Oxford is sitting there. The name just in front of Oxford is Green. That's Robert Greene, who was a servant of the Earl of Oxford, a poet, a playwright, a pamphleteer, who dedicated to Lord Oxford his a book called Guidonius. If you look at the name that comes just after Oxford, we have Thomas Nash, who was a servant of the Earl of Oxford, a poet, a playwright, and a pamphleteer, who dedicated to Lord Oxford his book called Strange News. If you look just above Oxford's name, we have John Lilly, who was a servant of the Earl of Oxford, who was a playwright, a poet, and a pamphleteer, who dedicated to Lord Oxford his book Euphues, his England. If we look just below Oxford's name, we have Anthony Mundy, who was a servant of the Earl of Oxford, a poet, playwright, and a pamphleteer, who dedicated to Oxford his book called Mirror of Mutability. I think you're getting the point, but one could also add Lodge there, who was certainly an acolyte of Oxford, Gascoigne too, Thomas Hayward. Thomas Hayward was in the play group, the combined play group of the Earl of Oxford and Lord Worcester. So you get the point. Oxford now, who takes the place of Shakespeare, is completely surrounded by his own theatrical gang of servants and apostles. And of course, William Shakespeare of Stratford, if he was still sitting there, would have no connection whatsoever to any single one of these people. So there is some right and reason why that little space has been left open for Oxford, and Oxford is, of course, remains among the English, the Apollo of the English. As we've seen, he has 8 names above and 8 names below, but more importantly, he remains the 17th word from the end. His name, of course, is followed by Thomas Nash with that rather beautiful T, that italicized swash font T of Thomas. If you look at the swash font T's in this paragraph, 1, 2 of Terence, 1 of Turpilius, and yes, of course, it's the 4th T. So we have Oxford represented as 1740. I don't want to prolong this presentation more than I need to here, because anyone who's been following the uploads I've done will notice that time and time and time again, we have Oxford as Shakespeare represented by the numbers 1740. The 17 obviously referring to the Earl of Oxford, and 40 is a representative of the fourth T, and that is Mercury or Apollo. Please look at some of those other uploads to get a handle on this if it's new to you. But again, I don't want to be too repetitive, and a lot of people who have been following these will know perfectly well that Oxford Shakespeare is many, many times referred to as 1740, and this is just to show that Mears is doing exactly the same thing. He is representing Oxford here as Mercury. So to finish off, I'll just show you what Ben Jonson has to say when he writes about Shakespeare in the first folio of 1623, and he's very, very obviously referring to this passage from Mears, and he knows exactly what it's all about. This passage you will remember, which is comparing Greek and Roman comic playwrights to the English comic playwrights, to show the English are just as good. And Ben Jonson, writing about Shakespeare, says, from Greece and Rome to honour thee, I would not seek for names, or when the sock is on, i.e. when you're writing comedy, leave thee alone for comparison of all that insolent Greece or haughty Rome sent or since did from their ashes come. Triumph, my Britain, thou hast one to show, to whom all scenes of Europe homage owe. He was not of an age, but for all time, and all the muses still were in their prime, when like Apollo he came forth to warm our ears, or like Mercury to charm. So, not only did Francis Mears know, but Ben Jonson, who also knew that Francis Mears knew. I hope you've enjoyed it. Hope you've understood it. Thank you very much for listening.